Shahidi, hey, milenici, gdje ste vi? Kraj česme, hej, stoji peškir vezeni i bardak, hej, od kojeg smo stvoreni. Šehidi, hej, milenici, gdje ste vi? Šehidi, hej, milenici, gdje ste vi?
Good evening. My name is Arnesa Poljushmich-Kustra. I am a survivor of war and genocide, and it is an enormous honor to be your compare tonight. It is a privilege to welcome you to United Kingdom's National Srebrenica Memorial Day to mark the 25th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide. I am grateful to you for joining us for this historical online commemoration, and I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of everyone at Remembering Srebrenica for joining us to mark this important anniversary and remember all of those who were brutally murdered in Srebrenica and throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina. What happened 25 years ago were some of the darkest times in our collective history. In the words of Judge Riyad of the ICTY, what we witnessed were truly scenes from hell, written on the darkest pages of human history. For fellow Bosnians around the world, today is a difficult and painful day, and a stark reminder of the worst of the inhumanity that we experienced. That cannot be forgotten, and I am truly glad that you are joining us to ensure that it is not. May I begin by introducing the founder and chairman of Remembering Srebrenica, Dr. Wakar Azmi, to formally welcome you to tonight's ceremony.
Good evening. It is my great privilege as chairman of Remembering Srebrenica to be able to welcome you to this historic occasion, the first UK National Srebrenica Memorial Day to be held entirely online. I am proud that our country commemorates Srebrenica Memorial Day with support at the highest levels from the government, cross-party leaders and cross-faith leaders. We are honoured tonight to be joined by His Royal Highness Prince Charles, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, President Shafiq Jafarovic and Angelina Jolie, who are amongst the distinguished speakers to be addressing us this evening. I am also honoured that we are joined by courageous survivors who will be sharing their testimonies. Srebrenica Memorial Day is a day we remember the thousands of Bosnian Muslims who were brutally murdered as part of a deliberate ethnic cleansing program. In the horrific genocide, up to 50,000 women were also raped and 2.2 million people were displaced. This year's remembrance is particularly significant as it is the 25th anniversary of the genocide in Bosnia. Our theme this year is Every Action Matters. This seeks to encourage every person to reflect upon their own behaviors and choices that they make and demonstrate that however insignificant it may seem, every action does matter. Srebrenica has become a world symbol of the horrific consequences that can result from inaction, and therefore taking action, however small, matters. The actions of individuals, journalists such as Penny Marshall and Ed Williami, who chose to not look away and risk their lives to access the notorious Ternopilje and Omarska concentration camps mattered, as it revealed to the world the true extent of the brutality. The actions of forensic specialists like Robert McNeil and Alison Anderson, who painstakingly gathered evidence from hundreds of mass graves, mattered, as it led to the legal ruling that Srebrenica was a genocide. Their actions have provided grieving families with the opportunity to bury their loved ones and find some closure. And of course, the Mothers of Srabanitsa and all survivors who, despite all that they have been through, have never sought vengeance and never acted with hatred, as they regard hatred as a sign of weakness, and they refuse to be weak, paving the way for reconciliation. And here in the UK, I am proud of the thousands of actions that ordinary Britons have been carrying out during this week alone. Over 1,000 memorial activities have taken place right across the UK in schools, local authorities, police stations, community centres and places of worship, bringing our nation together in acts of remembrance. These actions are helping to bring people together to help build stronger, more inclusive communities, free from prejudice and intolerance, and inspire the next generation to help ensure that hatred does not prevail. I want to thank Remembering Srebrenitsa's President, Lord Bourne, the chairs and members of our 8 English regional boards and 3 national boards, and of course each of our 1,450 community champions, all of whom have shown such determination and creativity in the face of COVID-19 to ensure that commemorations were still held this year. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Robert Jenrick at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government for funding Remembering Srebrenica, without which our important work would not be possible, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for their support. Tonight is important not just as an act of remembrance, but as a lesson for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osby, for those opening remarks and for underlining the importance that no matter how insignificant it may seem, every action matters and everyone can achieve a great deal, however small their action may appear initially. It now gives me great privilege to introduce to you our first speaker of this evening. His Royal Highness had been originally scheduled to visit Srebrenica in March and to meet with survivors and the mothers who lost their sons, husbands, and other male relatives in the genocide. Regrettably, the visit had to be postponed due to COVID-19, but we are honored that His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, is part of the program this evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am so very touched to have been asked to speak to you on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. And I can only say how greatly saddened I am that the current circumstances have prevented me from visiting Srebrenica in person this year. I had very much wanted to pay my respects at Potocari and the Memorial Centre, and to have the opportunity of meeting the Mothers of Srabanitsa, as well as other family members and survivors. It was important to me, therefore, that I should send this message to you today. I have cared deeply for many years about all that your country and the region have endured, and have followed with close interest and particular sympathy the steps you have taken on the long, hard road of reconciliation. I have greatly admired the difficult but essential work being carried out in Bosnia-Herzegovina to address the legacies of the past. And I have been deeply moved by the remarkable and courageous efforts of those working tirelessly in pursuit of justice, to rebuild trust, and to bring hope to their communities. The terrible events of July 1995, confirmed as genocide by international courts, are a dreadful stain on our collective conscience. The international community failed those who were killed, those who somehow survived, and those who endured the terrible loss of their loved ones. By remembering the pain of the past and learning its lessons, we can together resolve that it must never happen again. This is why the work of organizations such as the United Kingdom's Remembering Srebrenica is so vitally important, and why 25 years after these terrible crimes were committed, we should stand in determined solidarity with those who have lost so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that many of those families are still searching for their loved ones, and that the painstaking effort to locate and identify all those who were murdered at Srebrenica continues to this day. I can only begin to imagine the pain that must be felt by those who are still seeking answers and the closure they might bring. I have had the greatest pleasure of meeting some of those families of the missing from Bosnia-Herzegovina and from across the region on a number of occasions, most recently in London in 2018 during the London Summit on the Western Balkans, when I was delighted to welcome a group of families to my home at Clarence House. I've always been profoundly moved by their unwavering determination to find justice, but also by the extraordinary compassion that they showed for one another. As I said on that occasion, their dignity and humanity are a lesson to us all, and a reminder that reconciliation is not simply a theoretical, abstract concept. It is a matter of practical, difficult action, painful choices, and hard but essential compromise. Ladies and gentlemen, as we remember the victims of the Srebrenica genocide, those who died and those who were left behind, let us honor their memory by recommitting ourselves to the difficult, essential process of reconciliation. In so doing, let us take inspiration and encouragement from the compassion and dignity of those who still suffer today, and from the optimism of all those in Bosnia and Herzegovina who are striving to build a more just and brighter future.
Thank you to the Royal Highness for such powerful words and for your support of the victims and survivors of the Bosnian genocide. The United Kingdom is the only country outside of Bosnia to commemorate the genocide at a national level. The UK holds thousands of activities each year, has educated over 100,000 young people on the lessons of Srebrenica and hatred, and has created 1,450 community champions who have pledged to tackle hatred and intolerance in their communities. Remembering Srebrenica would like to thank the government for their support for Remembering Srebrenica, and on behalf of United Kingdom's government, I now introduce to you the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
25 years ago, when the terrible conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina had been raging for 3 years, Europe witnessed the worst atrocity on its soil since the Second World War. Over 8,000 mainly Muslim men and boys were killed in the genocide at Srebrenica, and more than 20,000 women and children were forcibly deported. I want to join with you once more in mourning the victims of those terrible events and to stand with the families in their fight for justice. As in so many cases from this conflict, which brought violence and destruction across the Western Balkans, many families still do not know what happened to their loved ones. Many perpetrators have still not been held to account. And there are those who would prefer to forget or deny the enormity of what took place. We must not allow that to happen. We owe it to the victims and to future generations to remember Srebrenica and to ensure it never happens again. I'm proud of the role Britain has played over the past 25 years in the fight for justice, including the work carried out by British judges, lawyers, and prosecutors. We will continue in that work, remaining by your side and working together to eliminate prejudice and discrimination so that we can create a safer and more hopeful future for everyone.
We are grateful to the British government for reaffirming their commitment and remembering the victims and survivors of the Bosnian genocide. Each year on July 11th, Bosnians and others around the world gather for a mass burial in the Velikoj Memorial complex. And this year, 9 more souls will be finally put to rest. To reflect with us on this year's anniversary, I am pleased to announce our next speaker, the chairman of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, President Šefik Džeferović.
Dragi prijatelji, dozvolite mi da vas pozdravim i da vam izrazim iskrenu zahvalnost što sudjelujete u ovoj komemoraciji putem interneta. Ova komemoracija nam pruža priliku da zajedno odamo počast onima koji su brutalno ubijeni, kao i onima koji su preživjeli i izdržali strahote kroz koje niko ne bi trebao proći. Ovaj trenutak nas također snažno podsjeća da moramo ponovno potvrditi svoju odlučnost i osigurati da se mržnja i predrasude koje su dovele do genocida i etničkog čišćenja u Bosni ne šire u našim zajednicama. Zahvalan sam što je u proteklih 7 godina Ujedinjeno Kraljevstvo organiziralo izvan granica Bosne i Hercegovine najveći broj komemoracija i događaja kako bi se obilježila godišnjica genocida u Srebrenici. Jasan i nedvosmislen stav britanske vlade da se genocid nikada ne smije zaboraviti, te da svijet treba biti na oprezu i spriječiti slične tragedije u budućnosti, uistinu je dragocjen za državu Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Veoma cijenimo potporu Ujedinjenog Kraljevstva, čija je vlada znatno doprinijela izgradnji memorialnog centra u Potočarima i radu Međunarodne komisije za nestale osobe, aktivno pomažući povratnicima u Srebrenici kroz obnovu i izgradnju infrastrukture i uspostavu organizacije sjećanja na Srebrenicu. Podupirem plan dobrotvorne pomoći za osnivanje prvog nacionalnog memorialnog centra i centra za učenje u Ujedinjenom Kraljevstvu i pozivam vas da podržite njihove aktivnosti na prikupljanju sredstava. Čvrsto podržavam rad organizacije sjećanja na Srebrenicu Ujedinjenog Kraljevstva. Činjenica da je tokom posljednjih 7 godina ova organizacija upoznala 100.000 mladih u Ujedinjenom Kraljevstvu sa lekcijama iz Srebrenice, organizirala 1200 memorialnih događaja i aktivnosti godišnje u različitim gradovima i mjestima širom Ujedinjenog Kraljevstva i 1450 aktivnih boraca protiv mržnje i netolerancije u svojim zajednicama, doista pokazuje ogroman učinak organizacije sjećanje za Srebrenicu Ujedinjenog Kraljevstva. Čast je podijeliti ovu internetsku platformu sa preživjelima. Odajem počast njihovoj ogromnoj hrabrosti i otpornosti pred neizrecivom tugom i nedaćama. Ne može se ni zamisliti koliko im je teško da ispričaju svoju priču. Zahvaljujem im što dijele svoje iskreno svjedočenje. Svi mi možemo uvidjeti snagu i mudrost iz svjedočenja preživjelih koji nam pomažu da sudjelujemo u izgradnji jačih, kohezivnih društava. Komemoracije poput ove čine sastavni dio procesa sjećanja. Nakon holokausta, rekli smo nikad više, ipak, samo 50 godina kasnije, ponovo je izvršen genocid na evropskom tlu. Zato je sjećanje tako važno. Ako želimo da spriječimo ovakva zlodjela u budućnosti, moramo osigurati da Srebrenica nikada ne bude zaboravljena. Danas odajemo počast žrtvama genocida u Srebrenici i potvrđujemo svoju obavezu da nikada ne zaboravimo ono što je sudija Međunarodnog krivičnog suda Fuad Rijad opisao kao istinske scene iz pakla napisane na najmračnijim stranicama ljudske historije. Moja poruka je jasna. Sjećanje i širenje istine o tragičnim događajima s kraja 20. vijeka je preduslov za sprječavanje mržnje i izgradnju sigurnijih, jačih i kohezivnih zajednica. Laži, samoobmana i neznanje potencijalni su izvori ponovnog nasilja i sukoba. Svi su odgovorni da se suoče sa greškama iz prošlosti kako bi se izgradila bolja budućnost.
Thank you, President Džeferović, for that powerful and important message. The Bosnian War and genocide came to an end in 1995 with the signing of the Dayton Accords, in which President Clinton played a part of. He officially opened the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial at Potočari in 2003 and continues to show strong support for Bosnia and its people. It gives me great pleasure to announce our next speaker, former United States President Bill Clinton.
I want to thank the Remembering Srebrenica UK Foundation and all our British friends for inviting me to address you today. I'm very grateful for the chance to say just a few words on the 25th anniversary of the genocide. In 2003, I was honored to take part in the dedication of the Srebrenica Memorial and Cemetery. And it was my privilege to come back 5 years ago on the 20th anniversary of the killing. I'll never forget that day either. It has been profoundly moving for me at every time, every opportunity, to continue to add my voice to those across the world who grieve for the families of those killed, to support the ongoing efforts to seek justice for those lost, and to recover their remains and bring them home to a final resting place. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to mark this anniversary because July 11th is so much more than just the dark time in Bosnia's past. It is also a bracing reminder of the terrible cost to all of us when we turn our backs on our shared humanity. Across the world, conflicts based on ethnicity, race, and religion continue to bring unbearable misery and loss to families, destruction to societies and economies, and heartbreaking numbers of refugees. Far too many people on earth today can personally identify with the mothers, the wives, and the children who lost loved ones at Srebrenica. 25 years later, we don't seem to have learned very much in a lot of places. Even as you have honored the difficult political compromises of the Dayton Accords, and most crucially, kept the peace, it is more important than ever to remember that in Bosnia and across the world, real democracy requires a genuine commitment to an inclusive society, including shared decision-making, a commitment to the rule of law, and uncovering the hard truths about the past so you can be free to make a different future. I hope in the next 25 years, all citizens of Bosnia and all of us around the world who wish you well will remember the sacrifice of July 11th and work even harder than you have already to preserve and strengthen the peace, to expand economic opportunity, to build an inclusive future for your children and grandchildren. Doing so will be a fitting tribute to those we remember today, and it'll provide an example to the next generation and to the entire world that the conflicts of the past need not overshadow the promise of the future. That's the real gift you can give in honor of those who paid the ultimate price. Thank you.
Thank you, President Clinton, for your words of support and for remembering the victims of the Bosnian genocide. Our next message is from the Croat member of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Željko Komšić, someone who has continuously emphasized the importance of genocide recognition as well as reconciliation within the country. It is my great honor to introduce President Komšić.
Poštovani, koristim prije svega priliku da se zahvalim organizaciji Remembering Srebrenica, kao i vladi Ujedinjenog Kraljevstva na svemu onome što rade kako bi se sačuvalo sjećanje na žrtve Srebrenice, genocida u Srebrenici, kao ljudima koji dolaze iz prijateljske zemlje, ljudima čija nam podrška pa i pomoć u čuvanju sjećanja na genocid u Srebrenici puno znači. Želio bih reći da sve ono što se događalo zapravo u Srebrenici u julu 1995. godine, uz značajnu šutnju i međunarodnih faktora koji su tada mogli zaustaviti sve ono što je bilo pripremano i što se nažalost desilo, koje su Bosanci i Hercegovci platili svojim životima, jeste zapravo centralna tačka genocida počinjenog ne više samo u Srebrenici, nego i cijeloj BiH. To je zapravo centralna tačka. Srebrenica je centralna tačka zločina koji se dešavao prema ljudima u Bosni i Hercegovini, ali i centralna tačka jednog anticivilizacijskog čina za koji smo mislili da se više nikad neće desiti nakon Drugog svjetskog rata. Čuvati sjećanje na sve ono što se dešavalo, pokazujući poštovanje prema žrtvama tog istog akta, ne zaboraviti u ime budućnosti Bosne i Hercegovine sve ono kroz šta je Bosna i Hercegovina, narodi u Bosni i Hercegovini, ali prije svega porodice ubijenih u Srebrenici prošli, jeste obaveza ne samo Bosne i Hercegovine, nego civilizacijska obaveza svakog dobrog čovjeka na cijeloj planeti. U tom smislu je važno sve ono što se radi na obilježavanju genocida u Srebrenici svake godine, a evo ove godine je nažalost 25 godina od tog akta genocida. 25 godina kada možemo reći da čak ni svi zločinci nisu odgovarali, da svi zločinci nisu dostupni ruci pravde. Nismo izvukli nikakvo iskustvo iz svega onoga što se dešavalo u Drugom svjetskom ratu, pa se ponovilo to u Bosni i Hercegovini krajem prošlog stoljeća. Izvucimo bar sada neko iskustvo kao ljudi, a ne samo kao Bosanci i Hercegovci, nego kao ljudi, da se to ne bi desilo ne više samo u Bosni i Hercegovini, nego bilo gdje u svijetu. Još jednom, uz riječi zahvale ljudima iz udruženja, odnosno organizacije Remembering Srebrenica i posebne zahvale vladi Ujedinjenog Kraljevstva u ime Bosne i Hercegovine, ljudi koji su pogođeni ovim, svih dobrih ljudi u Bosni i Hercegovini, ja upućujem riječi iskrene zahvalnosti. Hvala vam.
Thank you, President Komšić, for those immensely important reminders. We are delighted to be joined by our next speaker, the leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
As we mark Srebrenica Memorial Day, it seems incomprehensible that just 25 years ago such an inhuman genocide took place on our continent. Described by the United Nations as the worst crime on European soil since the Second World War, the killings at Srebrenica took the lives of over 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys and must never be forgotten. While it's right we remember those victims and their families who so cruelly lost their loved ones, we must also use the anger and the agony that crimes like Srebrenica bring to help us find the courage and conviction to stand up and say, never again. Unfortunately, in many parts of the world, we continue to see human rights abuses and persecution, but Srebrenica must teach us that we all have a moral obligation to speak out and act whenever and wherever people are targeted on the basis of their religion or race. Failure to do so only enables hatred to flourish. So let's use this day and the memory of Srebrenica not only to remember those we have lost, but to educate our future generations, bring our communities together, and renew our efforts to tackle hatred and prejudice wherever they lie.
Thank you, Sir Keir, for remembering the victims of the Bosnian genocide and joining us on this important date. Next, we are showcasing a unique musical project created specifically for the 25th anniversary. It has been created by the Welsh Board of Remembering Srebrenica. The board's co-chair, Abby Carter, brought together the Cardiff Ardvin singers and musicians in Wales and a choir of the Sarajevo National Theatre and the Sarajevo Philharmonic Orchestra in Bosnia and Herzegovina to perform together remotely during COVID-19 lockdown. The melody and lyrics of White Flower were written by Elvir Solak, who is a survivor of the siege of Sarajevo, and the song is about the soul of a victim describing his mother's heartache and depicting the infamous white flower that has become the symbol of the Bosnian genocide. The power of music and love has brought together nearly 140 volunteers, including 116 singers and musicians from the two countries that you will see in the video. What an absolutely moving performance that was, and a true showcase of solidarity between two very different groups. Thank you so much for everyone who participated in this special music program. The responsibility to remember the Bosnian genocide lies within all of us. As this year's theme teaches us, every action matters. Beyond race, religion, and ethnicity, we owe each other respect and solidarity. We are deeply honored to have with us 4 faith leaders, all of whom will discuss the importance of remembering Srebrenica and ensuring that such acts of hate are never again repeated. Our first guest is His Eminence Hussein Kavazović, the Grand Mufti of Bosnia.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, dragi prijatelji. Prije svega dozvolite mi da se zahvalim vladi Ujedinjenog kraljevstva, narodu nama prijateljske zemlje i vrijednom timu Sjećanje na Srebrenicu, koji su i u ovoj teškoj godini, kada se suočavamo sa pandemijom COVID-19, odlučili odati počast nevinim žrtvama genocida u Srebrenici. Slobodno možemo reći da Ujedinjeno kraljevstvo ima vodeću ulogu u svijetu u očuvanju istine o genocidu u Srebrenici. Od srca vam hvala. Ove godine u domovini i svijetu se obilježava 25 godina od genocida u Srebrenici. Živimo u nadi da će svijetom zavladati mir i zajedničke univerzalne vrijednosti, ljubavi i solidarnosti među ljudima koji neće dozvoliti da se on ponovi bilo gdje i bilo kada. Bosna i Hercegovina je kao i Ujedinjeno kraljevstvo multietnička i multikonfesionalna država i društvo. Raznolikost je bogatstvo koje nam je podario dragi Bog, a ne prokletstvo sve dok ne damo prostora zlim ljudima da šire mržnju i netrpeljivost i da naše raznolikosti sukobljavaju zarad svojih uskih interesa. 25 godina od genocida je prilika da Evropa i svijet nauče lekciju da mržnja i rasizam podjednako pogađaju sve nas, bez izuzetka, i da žrtve mogu biti podjednako i bijeli i crni, i muslimani i nemuslimani. Dragi prijatelji, žrtve genocida u Srebrenici posebno boli to što i nakon 1/4 stoljeća, nakon pravosnažnih presuda 2 međunarodna suda, 100 otkrivenih masovnih grobnica i 1000 svjedočanstava preživjelih, imamo ne samo pojedince, nego i zvaničnike kako u Bosni, tako i u susjednoj Srbiji, a nažalost u posljednje vrijeme i u svijetu, negiraju genocid, takvi svjesno ubijaju te ljude po drugi puta. Žrtve ne traže ništa do priznanja njihove patnje i stradanja. Oni traže istinu i pravdu, a bez istine i pravde svijet ne postoji. Ako želite da shvatite razmjere zločina i tragedije kroz koju prolaze preživjele žrtve genocida u Srebrenici, zamislite majke, sestre i kćeri koje se raduju kada nakon više od 2 decenije identifikuju bar jednu kost svojih ubijenih i kada je dostojanstveno pokopaju. Kada se sjećamo genocida u Srebrenici, to činimo ne zato što branimo samo pripadnike svog naroda, nego zato što želimo zaštititi ljudskost u ovom svijetu, ispričati istinu o zlu i dati smiraj žrtvama. Zato smo sigurni da će istina nadvladati i da ćemo svi u sebi naći snage da se suočimo sa prošlošću i nastavimo raditi na izgradnji povjerenja i mira u svijetu. Vjerske zajednice imaju značajnu ulogu na tom putu i mi u islamskoj zajednici u Bosni i Hercegovini smo predani međureligijskom dijalogu i izgradnji pravednijeg društva u kojem neće biti mjesta za veličanje zločinaca i njihovih političkih projekata. U takav svijet vjerujemo i za njega se zalažemo. Ohrabreni smo kada vidimo da nismo sami i da imamo prijatelje u svijetu koji dijele naše vrijednosti, našu bol, ali i našu nadu. Na kraju naše molitve upućujemo velikome Bogu da se smiluje nevino umorenim, da podari snagu njihovim majkama i potomcima da se nikada i nikome ne ponovi Srebrenica.
Our deepest gratitude to the Grand Mufti for such thoughtful words and for his continuous efforts in ensuring that the victims of the Bosnian genocide are not forgotten. It is with great honor that I introduce our next speaker, His Eminence, Cardinal Nichols.
I'm very glad to have this opportunity of sending this message for the Srebrenica Memorial Day here in the UK. This year marks the 25th anniversary of that terrible genocide, the worst atrocity in European soil since World War II. The genocide was the high point, the culmination of years of campaign of hatred and ethnic cleansing towards Bosnian Muslims. In Srebrenica alone, over 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered simply because of who they were. Thousands more were murdered in other towns and villages across Bosnia and Herzegovina, with up to 50,000 women raped and 2 million people displaced. Now, each year, a theme is chosen for this commemoration day, and this theme this year is Every Action Matters. That's a good theme because it reminds us that every single one of us can reflect on our own behaviour and demonstrate, no matter how simply, a real commitment to removing prejudice and hatred in our society. We really have to dispel the notion that each of us, one person, cannot make a difference, because we can. The action of an individual matters and can achieve a great deal. Today, on this Srebrenica Memorial Day, we honour and remember those who were murdered and commit ourselves not to forget them and to continue to learn the lessons from this particular incident in history. And it's a tragedy that is echoed in so many other ways around the world. We have to stand against the dehumanization of people, the dehumanization and the anti-Muslim hatred that were the source of these horrific actions. So I'd like to commend the work of remembering Srebrenica. The movement has educated over 100,000 young people. It's created 1,450 community champions, over 1,000 memorial events and activities across different cities and towns in the United Kingdom. I think the importance of learning about history and learning from history are so important. The best weapon we have is that of education. And therefore the programs of education that organisations like Remembering Srebrenica UK, the work they do is just so important. So please, let every one of us be committed to do what we can to counter prejudice, to counter this hatred that somehow flares up within the human soul. And today especially, we honour and respect our Muslim brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Thank you to His Eminence Cardinal Nichols for such kind words of support. Tonight, we are deeply honored to have the Chief Rabbi speaking to us, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis as our next speaker.
25 years ago, the world failed more than 8,000 vulnerable and innocent people who were the victims of prejudice, hatred, and violence. We have a collective responsibility to remember the Srebrenica genocide. However, remembering is not good enough. In the Hebrew Bible, the term for remembering is yizkor. Yizkor does not only mean a cerebral exercise through which I retain information, rather it implies as well the action that I must undertake as a result of all that which I remember. It is with this in mind that I very much welcome this year's theme for Remembering Srebrenica, which is Every Action Matters. Bearing in mind what we recall, those horrific events of 25 years ago, we now have a responsibility to engage in constructive and decisive action in order to pave the way for what will hopefully be a peaceful and harmonious future. But that will only happen through decisive action. It is therefore incumbent upon each and every one of us to challenge and confront the ideologies and forces of fear and hatred which threaten our fragile world right now. If we do that, we will be paying the ultimate tribute to the victims of Srebrenica.
Thank you to the Chief Rabbi for such passionate and thought-provoking words. It is my great privilege to announce our next speaker, Chairman of Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board, Imam Qari Asim.
25 years ago, the genocide of more than 8,000 Bosnian men and boys took place on the doorsteps of Europe. The violence, mass-scale rape, and systematic killing of Muslims in Bosnia symbolizes the horrors committed against Bosnians during the conflict between 1992 and 1995. I have visited Srebrenica many times and have felt that death still haunts Srebrenica. A sea of white tombstones in the Srebrenica cemetery reminds us of what intolerance and hatred can lead to if they go unchecked. Genocide is something inexpressible and incomprehensible. Fresh graves continue to be dug at the memorial cemetery, and in some cases, graves are reopened many times as and when partial remains of bodies are found. The families have not been able to find closure to their ongoing trauma. Many families still continue to search for the truth and an acknowledgement that genocide did take place in Srebrenica. But I was deeply touched by the forgiveness, courage, and hope that the survivors and their families continue to display. The ethnic cleansing of Bosnians may have happened 25 years ago, but the criminal acts of murderers still continue to incite hatred against Muslims. In Christchurch, New Zealand last year, the terrorists who brutally murdered 50 Muslims had been listening to a Serbian nationalist song which glorified one of the architects of Srebrenica genocide, Radovan Karadzic. Despite saying never again after the Holocaust, the world has stood by and watched many genocides play out. Europe's worst atrocity since the Second World War could have been stopped if the world had acted in a timely and decisive manner against the war criminals in Srebrenica. The theme of Srebrenica Memorial Week 2020 is Every Action Matters. Every action matters reinforces the point that doing something, no matter how small, can make a difference. The Holy Quran inspires us to act when it says, "Be witnesses in justice." Doing nothing to stop injustices or persecution is not an option for humanity. The potential genocide of Rohingyas and the systematic terrorizing of Uyghurs in China are examples at hand. The world must not fail these communities as it did fail Bosnians 25 years ago. The genocide of Srebrenica is a stark reminder that it can happen anywhere unless we learn to respect and appreciate our differences. With increasing levels of Islamophobia, we must challenge normalization of hostility towards Muslims. In post-Brexit Britain, we must stand against all forms of racism, bigotry, and xenophobia. This week provides us with an opportunity to reflect in our personal, professional and corporate lives to show that those who raise a voice against prejudice, hatred, and racism, those who stand up and unite against hatred, can make a difference.
Thank you, Imam Asim, for those thoughtful words. For the 25th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide, Message Heard and Remembering Srebrenica UK have partnered to create a podcast by the name of Untold Killings. This podcast will explore the genocide in further detail. We will now play a short trailer.
Over the course of one midsummer week in July 1995, more than 8,000 men and boys were systematically killed in a small Bosnian town called Srebrenica. It was meant to be a safe haven for Bosnian Muslim refugees fleeing a war that was tearing their country apart.
You are now under the protection of the UN forces.
But it turned out to be a death trap.
The UN, he says, they did absolutely nothing to protect us.
Those who made it out alive are still reeling because life can never be the same on the other side of a genocide. My name is Alexandra Bilic, and coming soon from Message Heard and Remembering Srebrenica, this is Untold Killing. We will tell the story of that one week through the voices of those who survived it. It is a story of what the world's willful ignorance towards ethnic persecution ultimately leads to. Subscribe now to Untold Killing in your podcast app to find out when the series launches.
Što te nema, or Why Are You Not Here, is one of Bosnia's most famous Sevda songs. Why Are You Not Here is often referred to as one of the most beautiful songs expressing longing and missing someone. It is a deep reflection of the constant pain and longing that the mothers and other survivors of the Bosnian genocide feel when they think of their families and loved ones. National Theatre's Elvir Solak and Aida Čorbajić soprano will now showcase a beautiful rendition of the Što te nema Sevda song.
Što
I think everyone watching that will agree how utterly powerful that rendition was. Thank you so much to Elvira and Aida. Selma Yahic was born in a village near Zvornik. She was just a child when the genocide began. It has taken her 25 years to tell her story of loss. For this reason, we are deeply grateful that she has decided to share that with us. It is my utmost belief that survivor stories are the most important way to learn the truth and to combat genocide denialism, which is ongoing even 25 years after the genocide. To share with us her story, here's Selma.
Good evening, my name is Selma Yahic. My family and I lived in a village called Blječeva in the area of Bratanac before the war. Before the war started, we lived a normal villager life. We had our own animals, like a cow, a few sheep, our own land that belonged since generations to our family, where we worked on the field. We would harvest things and feed and had food for ourselves. My grandfather and my father both worked. My father usually worked in outside of the country. My grandfather worked in Srebrenica in a factory. At the beginning of the war, things changed. First of all the Serbian citizens in our village disappeared overnight. Then second, the first attack started, and the first attacks were towards radio stations, TV stations, the electricity supply to the villages. And if you were able to see TV or watch TV or listen to radio, you mostly, if not just mostly, will listen to Serbian propaganda television or Serbian propaganda radio stations. Later on, during the war, the most difficult things, not just because people were killed all the time, it was we had no food, we had no medical supply. This was all before the UN troops arrived. People were struggling, people were hungry. There were cases where mothers will leave their children because they were not able to supply their kids. In our village, most of the times, little children will come begging for food. We had no food for ourselves as well, because we couldn't harvest anything. Shots were fired all around us all the time. During the war, I lost many family members. My great-grandfather, uncle of mine, died as well, was killed. Later on, my grandfather was killed in Potocari in 1995. Other family members, some of my uncles, cousins, were also captured. And a few uncles of mine who tried to get through the woods were also killed. After the war, we were reunited with my father in Austria. My father was not able to return to Bosnia in 1992 because he was working outside of the country in Serbia. So my mother told him he should not return and he should try to save his life and get outside of Serbia as soon as possible. After we arrived in Austria, it was very difficult for us to get by. First of all, my father was the only person who was working. My brother and I had to go to school immediately. We arrived in August. In September, we had to go to school. And my mother was also totally traumatized, but she had to go back to live like nothing ever happened. We never talked about the incidents that happened in Srebrenica. I kept quiet, my family kept quiet, and later on, as soon as the first family members of mine were buried, people started to talk. First time that I ever talked to anybody about the incidents that I remember were after they found the body of my grandfather. That was 2007, and later on I started to talk to my mother, and she also opened up. And this is really after 25 years, it's really the first time that I tried to share my story to the whole world. It is really difficult for me, and the reason why I do it right now is because I wasn't able to do it the years before. I'm still struggling with my memories, and it's still really hard for me to talk. And I want to encourage other people who may have gone through the same things that I did or similar things. Please share your stories. It's easier sometimes after you speak about it. And I want other people who hear my story to confront hatred. And I want to encourage anybody to share my story, not just mine, but the stories of anybody from this area, and to give them the platform to be heard, and for people to stop denying what had happened in Srebrenica. And I hope my story encouraged others to speak about their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Selma, for sharing your experience with us. We know that it takes a lot of bravery, and we truly are grateful to you and all the other survivors in speaking out and speaking about the truth. Our next guest was the very first British Prime Minister to meet with the survivors of the Bosnian genocide when he hosted them at Downing Street in 2013. And he led the first government funding that was announced for remembering Srebrenica. It is therefore a great privilege to introduce to you the former Prime Minister, David Cameron.
With many anniversaries, the thing we tend to remark on is how long ago something actually happened. But when we commemorate Srebrenica, it's how recent it was that continues to shock. Just 25 years ago, at the end of the 20th century, an unimaginable crime took place. Thousands of men and boys were separated from their families. They were murdered, and the world watched on. Genocide on our own continent after everything that had happened during the Second World War. Today, on Srebrenica Memorial Day, we reaffirm the UK's commitment to Bosnia and Herzegovina. We support efforts to identify the remains of the missing. We back the prosecutions of the perpetrators. We lead the world on preventing sexual violence in conflict. And we are the second largest commemorator of this dark chapter in history. Why? Because unless we remember, we are doomed to repeat. And we owe it to the victims, to their families, and to all future generations that never again really does mean never again.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron, for your support of the organization, as well as your constant reassurance that the survivors and their voices are heard. Our next speaker has played a pivotal role in the prevention of sexual violence. I am therefore very honored to introduce Lord William Hague, who served as Foreign Secretary from 2010 to 2014.
None of us who have visited Srebrenica will ever forget what we have seen there. It will always be in our minds and is now 25 years on from the terrible events of 1995. We will never forget the grim factory in which the victims were held, the fields and woods in which they lost their lives, and the cemetery in which so many thousands of bodies have now been laid to rest and brought back together. And I pay tribute to the International Commission on Missing Persons for their painstaking and difficult and compassionate work. What happened at Srebrenica was an act of genocide. It was a crime that will live on in our memories through the ages, and it was the greatest single act of evil on the continent of Europe since the Second World War. And 25 years on, we particularly remember the families and loved ones of those who lost their lives. I pay tribute to the Remembering Srebrenica initiative for the work in making sure that we keep faith with those people and that we remember the enormity and the extent of this terrible crime. But of course, it is part of the reason for that initiative, one of the reasons for that initiative, that we also remember the lessons, that we learn the lessons of what happened 25 years ago. And to me, there are 5 lessons, briefly stated. One is that this is a reminder of what happens if we allow hatred and extremism to grow unchecked. And we all have a responsibility to give our opinions, lead our societies, govern our nations, with that constantly in mind, to bring people together rather than to drive them apart. Second, it is a lesson that many of the things we easily take for granted today are very fragile, including peace, including the rule of law, including the assumption that people will behave according to any of the normal standards of civilization. And that means we need strong global governance and national governance across our countries to make sure that peace, the rule of law, and the norms of civilization are always reinforced. Third, it is a lesson that access to justice and avenues of justice are needed, including to international criminal tribunals where appropriate, and that in a conflict which saw so much gender-based violence, that it is vital to ensure that crimes of sexual violence in conflict are also prosecuted so that justice is done. Fourth, it is a lesson that we do have a responsibility to protect and a responsibility to act when it is in our power to do so and life is so clearly threatened. We will often be told many reasons for caution, many reasons to hold back. Sometimes we have to cast those reasons aside. Srebrenica was one of those where a responsibility to protect should have been in force. And fifth, it is a lesson that we must never neglect the Western Balkans and its role in the peace of Europe and the wider world. More than once in the 20th century, that lesson was forgotten. Remembering Srebrenica means we don't have to learn that lesson all over again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Hague, for such deeply supportive words. Our next speaker is a great friend of Bosnia and Herzegovina and former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright.
July 11th is a day for people of all faiths and nationalities to come together and commemorate the Srebrenica genocide. We mourn the loss of more than 8,000 victims. We honor the memory of those only now being laid to rest and those still missing. 5 years ago, I was honored to be there with President Clinton to participate in the 20th anniversary ceremony in Bosnia. I will never forget standing in silence as thousands of people, including survivors and family members of the victims, wept and prayed at the Genocide Memorial. It was a moving and gut-wrenching sight. But above all, it was a reminder that our work on behalf of victims and survivors is not over. All the perpetrators must be held accountable. The story of what happened must be told, and efforts to deny the suffering of victims must be opposed. That is the only way for truth and justice to prevail. Looking back, we recall that the tragedy of Srebrenica helped mobilize the international community to stop the slaughter and end the war. Looking forward, we hope that the memory of Srebrenica can help drive us toward a future in which all the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans live together in peace.
Thank you, Secretary Albright, for those powerful remarks. Remembering Srebrenica would like to thank the Ministry for Housing, Communities, and Local Government for the consistent support from their staff, ministers, and of course, the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick. We're very appreciative of their efforts to continue to fund the important work that we do here. We will now hear from the Secretary of State.
Today we meet a generation on from the worst atrocity committed in mainland Europe since the Second World War. We come together to pay our respects to the victims and to honour the bravery of those who survived the horror that took place in eastern Bosnia 25 years ago. Bosnia and Herzegovina isn't very far away from us. In fact, London lies closer to the town of Srebrenica than it does to Lisbon. That a savage campaign of systematic rape, of torture, of brutal ethnic cleansing, that genocide could take place on our European doorstep within living memory remains truly shocking and proof that hatred can take hold anywhere at any time. For many, daily life in the former Yugoslav Republic remains hard, attempting to reconcile the terrible events of the past whilst pain remains so ever present. Victims continue to be exhumed and identified, whilst for many families, the heartbreaking search for their loved ones continues. The main perpetrators of the massacre, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, are behind bars. But only last month, a Bosnian court found 3 more men guilty of war crimes. A former commander of the Bosnian Serb army has also been charged with assisting the 1995 genocide. Despite this, denial continues to flourish wherever the atrocities took place. That is why it's so important to engage and to educate young people about these tragic events. Remembering Srebrenica is working hard to ensure that we never forget the genocide, that we learn the lessons from it, and stand up to hatred wherever and whenever we see it. 25 years ago, a generation of Bosnian Muslim men and boys were murdered simply because of who they were. A generation of Bosnian Muslim men and boys were denied the chance to live out their lives and to fulfill their dreams. Each July 11th affords us the opportunity to remember them, to pause and reflect on the devastating consequences where hatred goes unchecked. This time last year, people gathered in their thousands from communities across the United Kingdom at hundreds of events in churches, in mosques, in synagogues, in schools and community centres to remember those who lost their lives and whose lives were changed by those events. And while many of those places of worship and learning are now open once more after the COVID pandemic, this year will of course be very different. So while we may not be meeting in person, we can remember together and ensure that the voices of those who grieve for over 8,000 murdered men and boys are never silenced.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Our next speaker is the Undersecretary General of the United Nations. I'm very pleased to announce that we have Adama Dieng with us.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear colleagues, I would like to begin by sincerely thanking the organizers of this poignant and important commemoration. To me, remembering what happened in Srebrenica 25 years ago constitutes not only a responsibility that we all share in humanity, but also an imperative to prevent the commission of such crimes in the future. We therefore must start with the humility to acknowledge that we still have a long way to go from achieving this objective. Yet, the lessons of Srebrenica make it all too clear that when the signs are there for all to see, we must spare no effort to take action to prevent such tragedies. I have heard and shared this call for recognition and action very often, but to me, it comes louder and clearer when expressed by those who have suffered the horrors of the past. In Srebrenica, the voice of the relatives of the victims, especially the mothers of Srebrenica, remain a source of inspiration for us all. I applaud their efforts to pursue justice and to champion the call for remembrance. 2 years ago, I had the honor of visiting the mothers at the Velikoj Memorial Center. On that occasion, I stood with them in fields that have witnessed unbearable suffering. I traveled to Srebrenica to honor the mothers' fight for justice and to pay tribute to their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, their sons, and in some cases, their entire families. These innocent civilians lost their lives when the most terrible of crimes was committed, the crime of genocide. But remembering is not only about revisiting the events of the past. When we memorialize past events, we ask for institutional support to the survivors and to those who mourn the lives that were lost. Memorializing is about telling them that their experience matters, not only to each individual, but to society as a whole. It is about telling them that they have a unique contribution to make to the future of their country and to the entire humanity. In short, dealing with the past means dealing with the present and dealing with the future. Victim suffering never ends, and neither should our embrace of their cause. This should start with the acknowledgement of the integrity of what happened. I remain in disbelief that some continue to question that the events of 25 years ago constitute genocide. Dear colleagues, genocide denial is real and concerning. It is presented proudly by people of influence and people with power. It is used to achieve political gain. It is echoed by non-accountable media organizations and platforms. It is spread via social media. It sows fear, mistrust, and hate. It divides people, communities, and states. It does not allow for healing and empathy. Instead, it is part of a well-thought-out strategy to deliberately push aside inconvenient facts, always at the expense of the victims and survivors. The International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia has determined conclusively that genocide was committed in Srebrenica in 1995. The International Court of Justice, as well as national courts, have consistently reached the same conclusion. Denying the seriousness of what happened, or even that crimes happen at all, is a grave offense which has real consequences. Genocide denial is an affront to the victims and an impenetrable barrier to any meaningful effort for reconciliation. It simultaneously feeds on and strengthens contested narratives about the past, the present, and the future. It turns perpetrators and war criminals into heroes. We must counter genocide denial strongly. All political leaders and all people in a position of influence, including religious leaders, must combat negative rhetoric and the glorification of war criminals with words of compassion and empathy toward the pain and suffering of their neighbors. Victims, survivors, and witnesses, the very people we are honoring today, are the true heroes. They have displayed immense courage by coming to the courts to testify against those who harmed them and others, those who gave orders to target civilians during conflict, those who flouted the Geneva Conventions. Despite the passage of many years, victims and survivors never gave up hope that they would see justice. We must always remember their suffering and honor their cause. Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear colleagues, the lessons of Srebrenica compels us to urgently take immediate action now. At the United Nations, reflections on the failure to prevent what happened in Srebrenica was instrumental to the establishment of the position of Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, which I have the honor to hold. This position is tasked with collecting and analyzing information, as well as with sounding the alarm whenever and wherever the risk of genocide exists. Many of the risk of indicators that we use today globally are informed by the lessons that we learned from the events that preceded the Srebrenica genocide. Those lessons have been learned by many. Here in the United Kingdom, Remembering Srebrenica is working to raise awareness on that terrible tragedy and to educate on the consequences of hatred and intolerance. This work is essential everywhere. No society is immune to the risk of genocide and other related atrocity crimes. The global rise in hate speech, intolerance, and the denigration of entire groups is of great concern. We must redouble our efforts to confront hatred where we find it. Ultimately, we all share the same objective: to work towards a world free of hate and division, in which crimes such as the ones that were committed in Srebrenica no longer happen. A world that has learned the lessons of the past, and a world where communities can live together in peace and dignity, as it is their inherent right. Acknowledging the truth about what happened and empathizing with those who have suffered greatly constitutes the first and essential step in this direction. Let us never deviate from this commitment. The victim deserves no less, neither does our common humanity. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dieng, for such a powerful and relevant message, and for all the work that you do to ensure that genocide prevention is brought front and center. Our final musical performance of the evening was a very special gift provided to Remembering Srebrenica by the National Theatre of Sarajevo's Elvir Solak and Aida Čorbačić. This particular rendition of White Flower was made especially for the 25th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide. The song speaks of the great loss, pain, and mourning that the mothers have experienced since they have lost their sons in the Bosnian genocide.
Zašto suze
Thank you, Aida and Elvir, for that deeply moving and powerful rendition. The image of an emaciated man standing behind a barbed wire fence has become synonymous with the early years of the war. In August of 1992, it was British journalists that uncovered the concentration camps of Prijedor. The man in that image is Fikret Alić, who is a survivor of the Karaterm and Trnopolje concentration camps. Tonight, we are deeply, deeply honored to be joined by him today.
Ja se zovem Fikret Alić i u svoje ime i u ime logoraša Bosne i Hercegovine želio da se zahvalim Velikoj Britaniji na velikoj suradnji što radi na ovoj našoj stvari, da se ne zaboravi i nikad niko ne ponovi i da se prestane negirati genocid u Bosni i Hercegovini koji se desio u toku proteklog rata u kojem je stradalo žene, djeca, starci i civilno stanovništvo. Znači, Srbi su ubijali na ovoj teritoriji Bosne i komplet Hercegovine, ubijali su znači žene, djecu, starce, ne birajući sredstva i oružje koje su koristili na našim majkama, djedoma, unučadima i djeci. Ja sam preživio logor Karaterm u kojem sam zatvoren 14.6.1992. U selu Sivcima smo me uhvatili kad je počelo čišćenje sela Sivaca, a ja sam bio kod svoje tetke, tu je počeo taj dan, taj dan je počeo masakr nad logorašima. U selu Sivcima kad su nas hapsili, odmah su nas počeli tući, maltretirati, ubijati i goniti prema autobusima. Ostali su iza nas lešev koji su danas nađeni, mrtvi ljudi koji nisu nikom ništa skrivili i koji su pokopani u selu Sivcima i koji im se znade danas imena i prezimena. Taj dan kad nas je potrebao autobus, odvezlo nas je u logor Karaterm, gdje nas je vozilo po stoku preko 200 ljudi u jedan autobus, znači trpalo nas je, nismo imali ni zraka, ni prostora za sjest, trpalo su nas bukvalno ko hajvane u kamione kad se trpaju i gone odvoze na nepoznati pravac. Kad smo došli u logor Karaterm, tu je počeo odmah masakar. Isti taj dan su nas počeli da tuču ispred logora Karaterma. Kad smo izlazili autobusa, morali smo da stavimo glavu na ruke na potiljak i da izletimo napolje i okrenemo se prema srpskim vojnicima koji su nas ispitivali imena i prezimena. Kako nas ispitivali, tako da su nas odmah počeli da tuču. Tukli su nas tu jedno oko sat i po vremena, ne biraju sredstva i oružje, što kažu, tukli su nas od šaka, batina, fundaka nadalje, da bi kasnije naredili da uletimo u spavone, gdje smo uletili u spavonu broj 2, gdje je već bilo prije nas logoraša koji su već ljudi bili ispamećeni od udaraca. A jedan autobus je ostao napolje cijelu su noć, te ljude tukli i to je bio ko film horor, ko film strave užasa, da bi neđe oko 6 prednoć pred sami, što kažu, mrak, pitali ima li ko žedan, nije smio niko reći da je žedan, da bi nas oko 9 navečer prebacili iz te spavone broj 2 u spavonu broj 3, da bi rekli kao navodno da nas raspodijele u manje grupe. U toj spavoni broj 3 gdje smo mi prebačeni, bilo je nas oko 220, pošto smo imali čovjeka ostale dane koji nas je morao registrovati po imenima i prezimenima, tako smo znali, prostorija ništa nije bila veća od možda 8, 6, sa 4 ili 8, sa 5 nije bila veća prostorija, nas je 218. Koliko je bio logor trajao. Sve strahote i užase su koristili i ubijanje nad nama. Ubijali su dnevno, ubijali su noćno, izvodili su ljude, sakrirali su ljude, koristili su razne palce, koristili su lance, koristili su sve što im je došlo do ruku, protiv nas su koristili. Najteža noć u logoru Karatermu je 24.7. kad su na 2 dana, na 3 prije davali ljude koji su povstali po selu Čarakov, koji su držali 3 dana gladne i žedne, da bi 24. ujutro pustili ljude da se napiju samo vode i pripremili su ispred one stolove i na tim stolovima puška mitraljeza i ostalo oružje. Niko nije znao šta će se desiti. Da bi pred noć počeo masakr, cijelu noć su ljudi jaukali i čuli su se zvuci metaka, noževa i ostalog jekanja ljudi, plakanja koji su basili suzavac uz povodom broj 3, koji su ljudi izdicali, skakali kroz prozore, na razne načine, pokušali spasti glavu, nisu uspjeli. Da bi sutradan ujutru došao pred povodom broj 2 gdje sam ja bio, došao Kajin koji je osuđen kao priznao genocid i zločin nad civilnim stanovništvom i dobio samo 3 godine, koje je sramota Haga, koje je toliko malo sudila takvu zločincu, koji danas šeta po prijedoru i zna ponekad staviti kokaru na glavu. Ali šta ćemo, mi smo već taj masakar vidjeli, doživjeli. Najteže je bilo ujutru kad su te ljude potovali u kamione po stoku, znači potovali su i 4 čovjeka na jednog i koji su odvezli prema masovnoj grobnici koju znamo, koja je danas otkrivena i nađena. Ti su ljudi nađeni u toj masovnoj grobnici. To je trajalo par dana, tek sutradan i opet se desio isti masakar sa manjim intenzitetom, odveli su 25 ljudi u nepoznatom pravcu, a 25 je ubijeno i da je po krugu logora. Do 4. avgusta jedno jutro smo se probudili i znači rekli su iznemogli, idu prema Prijedoračkoj bolnici kao navodno na liječenje, međutim kasnije se postalo da su vadili od nas krv za srpske borce. Nas je 25 odvezeno u bolnicu Prijedor, iz bolnice se vratilo 24, jedan je čovjek nestao, meni su izvadili neđe otprilike oko 2 litra krv po mom znanju, kako znam, pošto sam dobro dao krv, kad sam se probudio, vidio sam onu bocu i vidio sam iglu zabodenu u svoju venu. I doktorica je neka prišla i rekla izađite u hodnik, ode i vrati se u logor, preživće, ko osnoje bolnicu, bit će ubijen. Tako da se nas 24 vratilo, jedan je ostao u Prijedoru i dan se dani ne zna ni gdje ni šta je. I da bi sutradan 5. avgusta se pojavilo autobus ispred Kereterma, kome su mi bilo čudno, rekli su hajmo sada te palete i to smeće iza sebe pomete, ostavite u ćoškove i onda su počeli da prozivaju ljude koji su prvo prozvali 125 ljudi koji su odvedeni u Omarsku. Ti su ljudi prema Omarskoj poklati u autobusima i nađeni u masovnoj grobnici Kijevljanima i Hrastove glavici. Nas su ostale potrpali u autobuse i prebacili nas prema logoru Trnopolju. Ta jutro mi smo neđe oko 8 ujutru nas počeo trpa, do 11, tamo 12 smo već stigli u logor Trnopolje. Što su nas vozali ukrug, niko nije znao. Da bi se desio onda to ovako podne, po mojoj procjeni 1 sat, pojavila se ta televizija i ti razni novinari i sve. U tom strahu mi smo svi bili prepadnuti kad smo vidjeli te kamere i te mikrofone što trče prema nama, mi smo se prepali, počeli smo da u grupama bježimo kao da se stisnemo malo danas, kao ako pobiju da nas je manje boli. Međutim, odjednom u toj grupi pojavio se neki prevodioc koji je vikao ne bojte se, mi smo novinari. Tako da sam se ja u tom momentu krenuo i tako je nastala moja slika iz logora Trnopolja. Znači 5. avgusta je odjeknula u svijetu, da bi kasnije se dešavao još veći zlo. Pojavila se 8. i 9. avgusta lažne televizije i lažni novinari kao Rusi i Rumuni koji su donosili te slike njima da vide i onda su nas počeli po imenima prezimena proziva sa tih slika. Tako da sam ja imao tu nesreću gdje su me prozivali, ima jedan snimak na srpskoj televiziji gdje me prozivaju po sobi po imenu prezimenom kao Fikret Alić. Izgleda da su dobili sva imena i prezimena nas ljudi koji smo nešto rekli. Ja sam se krio po logoru, pa sam imao 2 burazira koje sam mogu po logoru kriti, gdje nas je bilo 5000 duša, pa si mogu, oni mene prenesu iz prostorije u prostoriju, od me snesu dole na igralište. To se sve odigralo do 14. avgusta. Ujutro su došli kamioni i autobusi i rekli su sada žene, djeca i starci i ostali kao idu na slobodnu teritoriju, ali ako nađe mušku osobu koja je sposobna za borbu ili nešto, bit će ubijena. Pošto ja nisam imao izbora da preživi više, imao sam jedan izbor da se obučem u žensku uniformu, obukao sam na sebe šalvare, žensku bluzu, zavio sam maram i uputio se prema autobusima koji su se utrpavale žene, djeca i starci, da bi i ja ušao među njima kao žena. Sve je dobro bilo dok jedan nije vikao, ako iko najdemo vojno sposoban, bit će ubijen usput. Međutim, ja nisam osjećao upaljen, pošto sam ja već imao trombozu stomaka, nisam imao izbora ili da umrem u Trnopolju ili da izađem pa preživim. Da bi nas vozili usput, vadili su, znači opet usput su nas tukli, provocirali, maltretirali, otmali zlata, pare, koje šta imao, da bi na jednom mjestu pred sami Goričane, pred sami gore Smetave, ustavljene su neke vode i rekli trebaju nam žene za silovanje. Među tim ženama, curama izveden sam i ja, ali međutim poslije imamo već proljev da izvenete trombozu stomaka, ja sam malo zaudarao i rekao ženu vratite u autobus. Tako da su mene vratili, ja sam ostao zahvaljujući što kažu živ. Stigao u Travnik do neke škole, usput sam oni vikali da vam nam jebe Alija majka, sad ste živi. Ja se nisam smio ni jednoj vojsci javiti, ni našoj, ni njihovoj. Spustili smo se u Travnik, preuzeli su nas neki busevi u Turbetu, prebacili se u neke dvorane, škole. Ja sam u tu školu ušao, prepoznao sam par komšinica, ja sam samo rekao da sam žedan i pao sam u nesvijest, da bi se probudio 24. augusta. U bolnici kad sam vidio svoje burazire koji su mi ispričali da su mi davali krve, da je bilo svega i svačega, da su 21. polo na Koričama te ljude. Onda sam se pokušao obući u armiju Bosne i Hercegovine, nisam uspio do 15. septembra gdje sam opet povratio krv i gdje sam poslat na liječenje u treće zemlje, da sam kasnije završio, znači iz Hrvatske, ošao u Sloveniji, Slovenije za Dansku, boravio u Danskoj do 2009. i vratio sam se u Bosnu i Hercegovinu, sad sam u svom Kozarcu. I dalje ne mrzim sve Srbe, mrzim samo ratne zločince i ljude koji su zlo napravili. Hvala svim organizacijama koji se bore da se istina pokaže.
Hvala, Fikret. Thank you so much for sharing such a personal and deeply moving testimony. We will heed your words. We are honored to be joined by the Mothers of Srabanitsa this evening. To me, and to many of us in Bosnia, they represent the true strength and bravery. Their constant pursuit of justice instead of revenge shows us the true empathy and humility of the Bosnian people and Bosnian genocide survivors. Our next guest is Shuhra Sinanovic, president of the Mothers Association of Podrinje and Bratanac and a survivor of the Srebrenica genocide.
Ovako, ja sam Šuhra Sinanović, predsjednica Udruženja žena Podrinja koje se bavi nestalim 92-95 iz Bratunca. Što se tiče, ostala sam u Srebreničkom genocidu samohrana majka sa dvoje malo djece. Tada sam imala 29 godina. Djeca su odrastala bez svog oca, bez svoje familije. Međutim, uključila sam se odmah po dolasku iz Srebrenice u Tuzlu na mirne proteste da pronađemo naše najmilije koji tada nismo znali da li su živi ili da li su zarobljeni. Nismo mogli da shvatimo da neko može ubiti preko 10.000 muslimana, bošnjaka za nekih 7 dana. Međutim, mirni protesti koji su se okupljali tada na početku 1995. godine u julu mjesecu, to je bilo ispred vlade kantona Tuzle i Međunarodnog crvenog križa. To su se sve okupljali spontano. Međutim, preraslo je sve to u udruženja, iako je naše udruženje žena Podrinja Bratunac, registrovano prvo udruženje, registrovano je 1993. godine, jer mi imamo svoje nestale iz 1992. godine u maju mjesecu u Bratuncu. Imamo 603 nestale osobe iz Bratunca 1992. i 2081 nestala osoba iz Bratunca 1995. godine. Inače, preživjela sam srebrenički genocid. U srebreničkom genocidu sam izgubila svoje 23 člana porodice, a izgubila sam 8 članova 1992. godine. Međutim, sve što se dešavalo u Srebrenici, to se nikad ne može zaboraviti. Sjećanja i danas, i nakon 25 godina, su faktički ista. Prvo, bombardovanje, glad, neimaština, nisi možda da obučeš, nisi možda da jedeš, nisi mogu da dokažeš dvoje malo djece, da nemaš da jedeš, da nemaš da obučeš, da svakodnevno se granatiralo. Nisi znao da li ćeš danas, ako se ustuži, da li ćeš preživjeti taj dan ili tvoja porodica. Međutim, sve se nekako tu dešavalo. Mi smo bili izgubljeni u tom vremenu. Svi ti koji su bili znači u Srebrenici, nije samo u Srebrenici bila opština Srebrenica, u Srebrenici je bilo 9 opština koje su našle utočište od 1992. godine do 1995. Međutim, spontano sam se našla i ja tu sa svojom porodicom. Nekad sve se i drugačije odvijalo dok smo bili na okupu skupa. Moglo se neko što si mogu i da tu gladi, tu neimaštinu nekakvu i koji nisi imao svoj ni krov nad glavom, ni ništa, moglo je sve da se prevaziđe dok smo bili skupa. Međutim, kada je došao je 11. juli, pad Srebrenice, znači počelo je granatiranje u stvari 7. jula i ja sam sa svoje dvoje malo djece se rastala od svog muža. 11. jula 1995. godine, to je bilo negdje možda prijepodnevnim satima, do tada smo iščekivali da nekako da nas zaštite, svi smo iščekivali da bombarduju srpske položaje, odakle su granatirali da se spasimo, da ne bi znači ni krenula ta muška populacija, dječaci prema da nađu utočište na slobodnoj teritoriji u Tuzli. Međutim, to se nije desilo. I kada sam se rastavila svog muža sa svojom djecom, on je mi obadvezu naručje, pozdravili smo se i njegove posljednje riječi su bila šuhra, čuveni, dobra djeca. To nikad ne mogu zaboraviti i kad je, kao da je imao predosjećaj da ih više nikad da ih neće nikad više ni vidjeti. I ta sudbina me je zadesla da ih više nikad nije ni. Iako su bili mali, moja Emina mi zapamtila svog oca. Međutim, opet kažem, hvala dragom Allahu i da mogu da i da znaju i da su prvo, da im nije dragi Allah podario da budu prvo pametni, zdravi i pametna djeca i evo, da sam ih izvela na pravi put. Međutim, posle 23 godine pada Srebrenici, dobila sam snahu, dobila sam i evo jednog i unuka, evo i čirka završava medicinu, hvala Bogu, uz Božju pomoć i moju veliku borbu koju sam se zaborila. Da prvo budu pametni, zdravi i da onda završe školu i da budu pravi ljudi, da ne mrze, da nikad nisam ih govorila na nekakvu osvetu, na nekakvu mržnju. Međutim, što se tiče od 95. pa sve do danas, 25 godina, sam uključena u sve što se dešava o nestalim osobama, pronalazak nestalih osoba, oko grobnica. Svaki put sa svojim članicama, kad se otvori jedna masovna grobnica ili pojedinačna, obiđemo odove. Vodimo evidenciju. Kolika je grobnica, koliko je ekshumirani kompletnih tipa, koliko je nekompletnih, koliko je skeleta, koliko je ukopanje, ko je identifikovan. I međutim, sve je to u udruženju povodom na kojem sam inače čuo. Što se tiče udruženja, nismo samo mi. Imaju 4 udruženja koja se bavi nestalim iz opštine Srebrenica. Tu su udruženje pokušanja kanala Srebrenica i Žepa, žene Podrinja, majke Srebrenice i udruženje žene Srebrenice. I svaka mi radimo u svom domenu, svaka zna šta je njihova obaveza, njihov posao, ali nama je jedan jedini cilj da se pronađu svi nestali, da se izvedu pred lice pravde i da dobijemo istinu i pravdu na ovim prostorima Bosne i Hercegovine, pogotovo za Srebrenicu. Inače, što se tiče, ja bih se zahvalila gospodinu Azmiju, Ismini i njihovom organizaciji koji i do sada, ja mislim, koliko su počele da obilaze memorijalni centar Srebrenica Potočari, da se zna istina šta je se desilo, da je preko 1200 do sada došlo iz Engleske da posjeti memorijalni centar Srebrenica Potočari. Koliko god narod gledao na televizoru, koliko god mu se ovako pričalo negdje na strani, dok ne dođe i ne vidi dolinu Bijelih nišana i memorijalni centar Srebrenica Potočari. To ne može se opričati. Međutim, tog čovjeka je vjerovatno nama Allah podario. Hvala mu za sve učinjeno, za sve njegove namjere i nakane da dođe, da vidi i da dovede tolike, dolazili su i lordovi, studenti, i religijsko vijeće, i obični građani, i ovo. Hvala mu na svemu. Ja bih poručila, jeste sad da je ova korona, ali proći će vadar i ovo. Naše dostojanstvo prema svim ljudima dobre volje koji su došli i koji imaju svoju misao ili nakanu, kako mi Bošnjaci kažemo, da i naumili da dođu, da dolaze. I nama je to u interesu da se dolazi, da se što više dolazi naroda, da se ispriča istorija, ono što se desilo u Srebrenici od 95. godine, mi kažemo 95. ono se dešavalo od 92. do 95. godine. Inače, mi imamo, hvala dragom Allahu, memorijalni centar Srebrenica Potočari. Memorijalni centar Potočari za nas, porodice, a pogotovo mogu da kažem za čitav svijet, je nešto što se ne može se opisati riječima. Koliko je nama to važno. Važan je memorijalni centar gdje se možemo okupljati, gdje se vidi šta je se desilo, pokop, bijeli nišani i sve. Međutim, tu je nešto što imamo da ostane trajna uspomena na dešavanja juli 95. Mogu da kažem i sa novim direktorom memorijalnog centra Njegovi ima stvarno finih ideja, projekata koji je započeo, a pogotovo nas je korona malo sram, što bi bilo za ovu 25. godišnjicu, ali nadamo se još da će biti. Što se tiče, prve dženaze su bile 31. marta 2003. godine, gdje sam ja ukopala svog muža i svih 8 članova porodice. Pa da druga 11. jula, a treća 20. septembra. Mi smo kao udruženje tražile da tad što je bio predsjednik Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, Bill Clinton, da dođe u memorialni centar, da otvori memorialni centar. Kaže, kad kažu zbog čega, što? Zato što je bio tad predsjednik okrenuo nam je leđa, gledao i čitao svi šta se dešava sa Srebrenicom. Međutim, to je doprinijelo najviše udruženje Pokret majke i glava Srebrenica i Žepa sa Mirom Subašić, koje su organizovane preko Američke ambasade i ovo da bi on došao 11. jula. Međutim, da nije mogo doći 11. jula, rekao je da je slobodan za 20. septembar 2003. Međutim, mi smo morali svoje porodice koje su trebali da ukopaju da ostave pola za 20. septembar. I da je došao Clinton i otvorio memorialni centar Srebrenica Potočari. Od tada, pa evo svih ovih godina, da od tada se počeo da zna za Srebrenicu. Ali mi kao porodice žrtava, mi smo od prvih dana govorili da se desio genocid, I evo, imamo i presuda i u Haškom tribunalu, imamo jednu presudu u sudu za ratne zločine, ali nas kao porodica boli posle 25 godina. Mi imamo danas zakon o negiranju genocida. Nadamo se do ovog 25. godišnjice da ćemo i to, ali taj zakon da nije samo dobar za porodice nas genocida, nego za čitavu Bosnu i Hercegovinu. I kad imamo zakon o negiranju genocida, ne može niko, ni one presude koje su donešene, uvažavati. Tako da bih inače za 25. godišnjicu znamo da je korona, da je sve. Molim se ljude dobre volje koji žele da se uključe pa da bar nekim video linkom, da daju nekakvu izjavu, neku poruku da nismo same, da se suosjećaju s našom bolom, s našom tugom i nakon 25 godina.
Thank you, Shuhra, for your bravery in sharing those deeply moving and important words. Our final testimony this evening will be given by Bunira Subasic, President of Mothers of Srabanitsa and Žepa enclaves. Munira, along with the Mothers of Srebrenica, has paved the way for justice and recognition of the genocide. She has done an immense amount of work, and all of us who are in this field, fighting for justice, owe her a great deal. We are honored to have her join us once more in commemorating Srebrenica.
Ovako na početku želim da se zahvalim organizaciji koju vodi Azmir Vakar, Amel, Amra, Emina i svi drugi koji rade, koji se sjećaju Srebrenice i koji sa svojim radom žele da se Srebrenica ne zaboravi. Mi majke koje smo preživjele genocid, evo 25 godina, borimo se za istinu i tražimo pravdu. Žalosno i jako tužno da 25 godina dočekujemo stradanja genocida, a da nemamo zakon o zabrani negiranja genocida. Da još uvijek u Bosni i Hercegovini u jednom dijelu entiteta se negira genocid. Da djeca se truju, da su djeca bolesna. Mislim da je potreban zakon i trebalo ga je donijeti. Hvala engleskoj vladi i svima koji se potrudili 2015. da taj zakon zaživi. Međutim, nažalost, nije došao, ali ipak mi evo i posle toga, 5 godina toga našeg rada uvijek kažemo da je na prvom redu da zakon o zabrani negiranja genocida je važan, da zaštiti sve ljude, pogotovo mlade, jer budućnost naše zemlje i budućnost posle nas su naša djeca, naša unučadi, mladi koji će ostati za nas, koji će graditi Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Bosna i Hercegovina je jedna divna zemlja kojoj treba pomoći da proživi i da dođe do istine i da svi oni koji negiraju genocid da prođu kroz istinu. Istina će ih osloboditi od mržnje, od osvete, od svega. Ako smo mi majke uspjele da našu djecu koja su ostala bez oba roditelja, bez jednog roditelja, koja se rađala posle smrti svojih roditelja, ako smo uspjeli da odgojimo tu djecu i da ta djeca nemaju mržnju, da nisu napravili ni jednu osvetu, da su se školovali, da su sad doktori, inženjeri, profesori, da govori 2-3 strana jezika, da su najbolji studenti bivali po čitavom svijetu i od Amerike, Australije, Azije, Afrike, Evrope i svugdje. Iako su uvijek nosili bol, iako još uvijek mnogi od njih nisu imali ni sliku da znaju kako izgleda njihov otac, a kamoli šta drugo. Mislim da je važno da se taj zakon donese i zato ja pozivam sve dobre ljude koji mogu pomoći, da pomognu da mi majke nekako dođemo do toga zakona. A kad budemo imali taj zakon, onda ćemo znati, onda će biti prava istina, onda će biti povjerenje među ljudima, oni koji su počinili genocid. I oni se, iako nisu pokajali, a kad čuju taj zakon i kad budemo mi majke zaštićene kroz taj zakon i naša djeca, mislim da će oni onda misliti drugčije i drugačije. Mi majke koje smo izgubile svoju djecu, znamo da našu djecu ne možemo vratiti. Da znamo da život nema reprizu, da ne možemo, samo možemo učiti nešto iz prošlosti da bi imali bolju i sretniju budućnost. Mi smo kao udruženje Pokret majke enklava Srebrenice i Žepe koji se registrovao 1996. godine fokusirali se na istinu i na pravdu. Želeli smo da naša djeca ne budu gajanja u mržnji, u osveti. Želeli smo da naša djeca budu najbolja i u tom smo stvarno uspjele. Ja s ovoga puta želim da zahvalim našim majkama koje su pored velike muke, koje su protjerane, istjerane na ulicu, koje su vodile po jedno, po dvoje, po troje djeci, koje su morale biti i otac i majka, da su uspjele da školuju svoju djecu i da svoju djecu odgoje onako kako treba da se odgoji. Naša djeca nisu bila plemena, pošto često puta vidim ja i u medijama i neki ljudi to kažu. Moj sin je ubijen u Leviskama, moj sin je ubijen u Adidaskama, moj sin je bio u Evropi prije nego što sam ga i rodila. Mi smo evropski narod, mi nismo narod koji ne zna i koji nije znao šta znači ljudska prava, šta znači drugčiji, drugačiji, šta znači poštovati nekoga, šta znači škole završavati. Mi smo narod, svjetski narod. Mi ovo što smo doživjeli na kraju 20. na početku 21. vijeka treba da se stidi i Evropa i svijet. Treba da se stidi kad su trebala da se poštuju ljudska prava, kad su naša djeca trebala da živi, kad su naša djeca trebala da idu u škole, da uče, oni su nažalost, morali smo ih tražiti po grobnicama, morali su biti ubijeni samo zato što se drugčije i drugačije zvali. Svijet je mislio ako pobije nas muslimane, bošnjake u Bosni i Hercegovini, da će uspjeti u tome svemu, a ja kažem da mi, bošnjaci, muslimani u Evropi i Jevreji koji su bili u Evropi, mi smo bili manjina. Evropa je se trebala pobrinuti, zaštititi manjine. Politika i engleska, i njemačka, i francuska, i sve politike koje su bile 90. godina, bile su pogrešne politike. Ali evo, zahvaljujući dobrim ljudima, zahvaljujući našoj organizaciji koja je vodi Vaka, mislim da su svi obični ljudi, dobri ljudi, školovani ljudi, profesionalci, intelektualci, svi su saznali šta se stvarno desilo u Srebrenici. Njemu hvala na tome i hvala svim ljudima koji pomažu da ta organizacija živi. Nije to važno samo zbog nas majki, nego je to važno zbog budućnosti svijeta, zbog budućnosti Evrope. Ne možemo graditi sreću na nečijoj nesreći. moramo se naučiti i moramo kazati stop nesreći, stop negiranju genocida, stop ubijanju i trebamo poštovati jedni drugi. Trebamo voditi računa kako ćemo graditi bolje sutra. Bolje sutra za našu unučad, za našu djecu i za sve dobre ljude koji vole život i koji vole Europu, Bosnu i sve druge zemlje u kojima žive. Svaki čovjek koji se rodio ima pravo na život. Svaki čovjek ima pravo na svoju vjeroispovijest. Svaki čovjek ima pravo da se školuje. Svaki čovjek ima pravo da se opredijeli onako kako želi. I svako bez obzira kojoj boji kože pripao, kojoj vjeri pripao, on ima pravo da određuje svoj život. Ne smije ugrožavati ničiji život, ali njegov život je njegov život. I taj njegov život treba se poštovati, a ne gledati da njegov život se uništi, a da ostane onaj ko ništi živote. Ja znam da u Bosni i Hercegovini postoji više ljudi, više naroda, više nacija, da u svakoj naciji ima dobrih ljudi. Ne možemo kazati da su svi Srbi zločinci. Ima dobrih Srba, ali ipak njihova politika koja se vodi i posle 25 godina dobri ne mogu da dođu do izražaja od onih koji su počinili genocid, koji nisu prošli kroz istinu. A kad prođu kroz istinu, istina će ih osloboditi je toga što se zove mržnja, znači pravu stvar i mislim da će prihvatiti sve ono što se dešavalo 1995. godine. Ono što se desilo 1995. godine, to se ne može vratiti, ali se mora naučiti, ne smije se zaboraviti. I zato smo mi, majke, digle svoj glas. Želeli smo da našu djecu vratimo tamo gdje smo zadnji put i vidjeli, a to je Srebrenica, Potočar. Da obilježimo mjesto zločina, mjesto genocida, napravimo jedan memorijal. Ne da taj memorijal posjeća na osvetu ili na mržnju, nego da taj memorijal bude opomena ne samo u Srebrenici, nego u cijeloj Europi i čitavom svijetu. I uspjeli smo, hvala Bogu, u tome. Našu smo djecu vratili, nažalost nismo ih vratili žive, nismo ih vratili na nogama, našu smo djecu vratili u sanducima, ali i tabutima. Ali danas imamo memorijal gdje imaju bijeli nišani, gdje su ispisani, izvezeni imenima i prezimenima naše djece, gdje svako može doći i osjetiti. Svaki nišan će govoriti za sebe i posle naše smrti i za vrijeme našeg života. Znači, i sve ono što, i mislim da mnogi ljudi koji dođu da nešto nauči, da ne treba nama sažaljenje, nama treba pravda. I mi nikad ne tražimo sažaljenje, da nas neko sažaljava, nego želimo da imamo pravdu, da živimo kao Evropljanke, kao i sve druge majke. Svaka majka, bez obzira kako se zvala, kome je pripadala, bila ona Bošnjakinja, Srpkinja, Hrvatica, Romkinja, Jevrejka, Amerikanka, to je majka. I ona ne može ništa drugo biti. I svaka majka želi dvije stvari, koja je izgubila svoje najmilije. To je da pronađe kosti svoga sina i da zločinci koji su ubili njenog sina da izađu pred lice pravde. Ako se naša djeca zovu žrtve, moraju imati zločinca. Zločinci koji su počinili zločin moraju imati svoja imena i prezimena. Mi smo majke Srebrenici, majke enklava Srebrenici i Žepi uspjeli u tome i dosta. Mi sarađujemo i sa drugim majkama. Mi znamo, osjećamo i bol i druge majke. I ne možemo biti mi veće majke nego druge majke. Ali, nažalost, politika koja se vodi još na ovim prostorima je ta koja ubija i koja ne dozvoljava da pravda izađe na površinu. Još uvijek nije samo u jednom dijelu Bosne i Hercegovine, nego i u Srbiji. Tamo odakle je počela agresija na Bosnu i Hercegovinu, gdje je tamo Akademija nauka i umjetnosti uradila projekat da počinje se genocid na kraju 20. na početku 21. vijeka nad Bošnjacima, muslimanima u Bosni i Hercegovini. Tamo je tabu tema genocid, tamo se ne smije spominjati. A smo mi, majke, uspjele da sarađujemo sa velikim brojem nevladinih organizacija, Žene u crnom, Mladi, Fond humanitarno pravo. Znači ima puno tamo organizacija koje se bave istinom, koje znaju pravu istinu i pravdu, s kojim mi jako dosta sarađujemo, s kojima dijelimo ono što treba, a to je da se što više zna istine, da se što više osudi i da što više mladi dođe u Potočare da posjete memorijal i to mi smo dosta uspjeli. Pravili smo 4 velike konferencije sa Haškim tribunalom gdje smo dovodili studente po prvi put iz Srbije, Hrvatske, Makedonije, Crne Gore, Bosne i Hercegovine. Želeli smo prvo da ti studenti čuju priču o predstavnika Haškog tribunala koji su radili na suđenjima, na presudama, istražioce, sudije, tužioce, da čuju pravu stvar. A onda smo želeli da se naši mladi upoznavaju, da dijeli iskustva, da komuniciraju, da na neki način šire istinu. I u tome smo jako dosta uspjeli. Zadnja konferencija koja je bila, imali smo jedan veliki broj studenata iz Amerike koji su došli i koji su stvarno nama poslali dosta pohvala na našoj konferenciji. Također smo uspjeli da jedan broj ljudi, običnih studenata, dođe u Potočare iz Srbije. I mislim da me je jako danula jedan student koji je obišao mezarje u Potočarima i onda je sa velikim uzdahom i suzama u očima prišao meni, zagrlio mene i kazao: nisam do sad znao, lago me je moj otac, lago me je moj djed. Sad kad dođem u Beograd kažu mi da su me lagali, da mi nisu kazali pravu istinu. 77 momaka moga godišta je ubijeno u Potočarima, napisao sam na papir, a tada su bili 95. godine samo djeca kao i ja. Nisam znao ni šta se je desilo, ni šta se dešava. Zato je vrlo važno da se govori o Srebrenici, da se priča o Srebrenici, da se ne zaboravi, ali ako zaboravimo, onda će nam se ponoviti.
Thank you to Benita and all the Mothers of Srebrenica, as well as all the other genocide survivors from Bosnia who continue to speak out and share their stories with so much bravery. As with every year, on July 11th, the remains of those that have been located in mass graves throughout the year get to be buried and finally put to rest. This year, 9 more men were buried. Their names were Sad Hasanovic, who was born in 1971, Alija Suljic, who was born in 1969, Hasan Pezic, who was born in 1925, Hasib Hasanovic, who was born in 1970, Zuhtija Avdakic, who was born in 1947, Bajro Salihovic, who was born in 1943, Ibrahim Sukanovic, who was born in 1941, Salko Ibišević, who was born in 1972, Kemal Music, who was born in 1968. We remember them, we honor them, and together we gathered to make sure that nothing like what happened in Srebrenica ever repeats to anybody else ever again. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to announce our keynote speaker for the evening. She has been a longtime friend of Bosnia, has worked directly with victims and survivors of the genocide, and advocated on their behalf. She is currently the United Nations Special Envoy, filmmaker, and activist, Angelina Jolie.
I'm thinking today of the Mothers of Srabanitsa and all of the other survivors whose husbands, brothers, and sons were murdered in the genocide 25 years ago. I think, too, of the victims, in particular the children, who were denied the chance to live and love and have families of their own. It is a loss beyond words. And I think of all the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that beautiful, heart-shaped country in the heart of Europe, which has given me so many dear friends and wonderful experiences, and which to me will always stand for strength and warmth and dignity. To the people of Bosnia, I send you my sympathy and my respect, and I grieve with you. I want to speak today to the young people in the region and beyond. You were not born when the Srebrenica massacre happened. You might wonder what it has to do with you. But the kind of hatred that led to Srebrenica exists still, as you well know. It lives on wherever people find excuses to single out others and deny them their rights as equal human beings. Srebrenica was a crime that did not happen overnight. It could have been prevented, even down to the last few hours. It started with prejudice and discrimination, with hate speech that demonized a whole people and treated them less than human. It was spread by leaders who used lies to manufacture fear, to condition people to accept violence. These tendencies still exist in our world and are as dangerous as they have ever been. Of course, not all hatred and discrimination leads to genocide, but all genocides begin with a failure to challenge these behaviors. Your generation can resist this. It already is, and that gives me hope. You do not need to be prisoners of the past. You can resist attempts to divide you from anybody else on the basis of their nationality or ethnicity or religion or the color of their skin. You can reject discrimination and hate speech and propaganda and lies. You can share a vision for a world built on equal rights, equal laws, respect for difference. A world in which the kind of murderous agenda that led to Srebrenica could not exist, would not succeed. That is the best way we can honor the families we remember today, and the victims of persecution everywhere, with whom we can be proud to stand.
Thank you, Angelina, for those important words and for your continuous support of the victims and survivors in Bosnia, but also throughout the world. The Bosnian genocide has and continues to impact generations of people. While younger generations may not have experienced the genocide for themselves, they continue to be impacted by it. Tonight's prayer will be read by second-generation survivor Amra Jakupovic.
My name is Amra Jakupovic, and I'm a second-generation Srebrenica survivor. The 11th of July is by far the saddest date in my calendar, as it is for many other Bosnians across the globe. Whenever I think about Srebrenica, I associate it with two things: reflection and respect. I believe that it is so important for those that survived the Srebrenica genocide to tell their story, and I think it is just as important for people just like me, second-generation survivors, to learn about what happened during the war in Srebrenica and other areas of our country. We must be persistent in our fight for justice. As well as reflection, I think it is important to pay respects to those that innocently lost their lives in Srebrenica for our people, our religion, and our country. I am deeply saddened that I can no longer take part in the annual peace march, known as Mash Mira, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. I hope to do so next year and walk the path my father and many others just like him once had to survive the terrors of Srebrenica. I will now read the Srebrenica prayer. U ime Boga milostivog, samilosnog, molimo te Bože, svemogući, neka tuga postane nada, neka osvjeta bude pravda, neka majčina suza bude molitva, da se nikome nikada ne ponovi Srebrenica. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, we pray to Almighty God. May grievance become hope. May revenge become justice. May mothers' tears become prayers. That Srebrenica never happens again. To no one and nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Amra. I would now like to invite the president of Remembering Srebrenica, Lord Bourne of Aberystwyth to say a few words.
I'm extremely proud to be president of Remembering Srebrenica, and never more so than this year, our 25th year since the dreadful genocide, when we've been commemorating against the backdrop of COVID. I have, as president, many thanks to give. First and foremost, could I thank the survivors who've given such powerful testimony with such courage and such grace. Many people have given statements of support, strong and powerful statements. Could I thank them too? Above all, could I thank His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the President of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and national leaders from around the world. It's very important that we learn the lessons of the past. That's why it's so important that we remember the dreadful genocide on European soil 25 years ago, to ensure that we learn those lessons and that that is never ever repeated. Could I also thank Dr. Wakar Azmi and his Remembering Srebrenica team and the 11 regional and national bodies that make up the United Kingdom. 1,400, more than 1,400 in fact, cheerleaders who've ensured that we put on over 1,000 episodes and events of commemoration this week. It's been outstanding, it really has. The prime theme this year has been Every Action Matters, so that every ripple has an effect in the pool. Every action has a reaction. Actions that may seem very small actually go on to have a beneficial effect and help us learn the lessons so that we don't repeat those past mistakes. I'd also like to thank the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and Secretary of State Jenrick, who is the sponsoring department and the sponsoring minister, and to thank national leaders too for their support. But could I thank above all you for what you've done this week to ensure that this commemoration has been so effective against the backdrop of the dreadful COVID crisis. We have done an outstanding job. You have done an outstanding job. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Bourne, for those deeply kind and supportive words. As we mentioned earlier, this year's theme is Every Action Matters. And our team at Remembering Srebrenica has done a magnificent job of really showing how every action does make a difference. Despite the pandemic and all the worries that came with it, they have ensured that this event is not only successful, but is a dignified event, worthy of the victims and the survivors of the Bosnian genocide. I would like to take a moment to express my deepest thanks to Amel Khan, Kate Williams, Amre Mukanovic, Francesca Cleverly, John Allison, Joshua Pritchard, and Adam Smith for their efforts in helping to organize this commemoration. I would also like to thank all of you for tuning in and watching and remembering the victims and the survivors of the Bosnian genocide. While today is the anniversary of the Bosnian genocide, the work must continue. We must continue to work towards ensuring a better future for us all, and we must continue to remember the victims and the survivors of the Bosnian genocide. Please join us at Remembering Srebrenica. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and look us up online at www.srebrenica.org.uk. Thank you.
Kraj česme hej stojí peškir vezení I bardak hej od kojet smo stvorení šehidi hej milenici gdje ste Shahidi hey Srebrenici jeste Shahidi hey evliyadet jesteri Upravu hey traktabana boseni Poklanja hey na sofama zeleni Poklanja